Trigger warning.
Some people may find topics discussed in this episode difficult. Please proceed with caution. You're listening to The Frankie Files. FrankieFilesPodcast.com. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 40 of The Frankie Files. Well, it's been quite a year over the course of episodes 1 through 39, Season 1, 2022, when I started this podcast in February. Just recently, I've been contacted by one real ex-Morningland member, and that's pretty amazing. This person would like to be interviewed in the future and definitely knew my sister, my mother, and I, and so this is pretty cool. This is exactly why I started this podcast. To begin to get some answers and to get the story out about Morningland Church / Morningland Community, aka the monastery in Long Beach, California, the cult I survived. The man that contacted me was given the show podcast info by a different member. So we're getting in contact with several people who can help flesh out this story. That's big news. My mom and I are working on compiling a lot of info about the church over the last 50 years. And now we have help. Those people who have books and recordings made by the church leadership to help the documentation remain authentic, not just vague memory. The Frankie Files podcast is about revealing contemporary cults like Morningland in a documentary form, as well as offering essay narratives to survivors on the topic of cults, mind control, and sexuality. Researching has been amazing. But as a survivor, telling other people's story is the hardest part so far. It can be randomly triggering, and it can bring unwanted memories and emotions that are unplanned. But I'm still really happy to get a variety of stories out there. I also had an amazing conversation with a leader in cultic studies who has authored 7 or 8 books in the field available to laymen and university studies alike. Dr. Lalish has special knowledge in not only a woman's experience in a cult, but the New Age religion. Her books are highly recommended by me. I'm working my way through all her books now. I recommend you check out janjalallich.com for details about all she can offer. I've received more answers about my own experience from her work than I have in years. Her humility and understanding really shines through. It's been a great experience doing the podcast, and I'm also happy for the break. But I'm leaving you with 20-some hours of content for your listening. I'm so excited to present to you here the best moments of Season 1. It all started with writing a draft of my cult story memoir. I found my voice as a survivor. I'm even hosting now a weekly chat online about cults for anyone who wants to join. I would encourage you to do so. Check out further announcements on Twitter at Frankie Tees or on Reddit at Frankie Tees. You can also check out FrankieFilesPodcast.com on the blog. The show will not produce new episodes November, December, and January, but will return February of 2023. Without any further delay, here is the best of Season 1. Enjoy. Episode 1, the inaugural episode of Frankie Files Podcast. You can hear all the nerves. Deciding to speak out and further put a target on my back wasn't easy. I've come so far since February of 2022. In episode 1, I explore propaganda. It's only through propaganda that we are coerced into cults. It can happen to any one of us. An ongoing Halloween. Check out my excerpt from episode 1. It was super difficult for me to choose which topic I should start out with on this inaugural podcast. Victim shaming? Sexual assault in the news? Straight cult awareness? All very good places to start in diving into what I have learned. But instead, I settled on the very most used technique of mind control that still exists everywhere in the world today: propaganda and dogma. Let me get into it now. Our first job is to recognize how the mind gets tricked. First, we hear or see something that gets our attention, and we're convinced of that one fact. Then that fact or ism is used to get us to do a bunch of things that we would never have done without believing that thing. It's that simple. Propaganda is a trick. Dogma is a trick. It's a way of saying, I have knowledge you want. Do this to get it. There, you were mind controlled. Those outer pressures take you away from yourself and your sense of well-being. Signs of mind control or indoctrination include, from my own experience, a nagging anxiety that you need to fill, a hole, a sense that this will solve a bunch of other problems, an actual addiction. None of these things are true. Religions won't solve that you have to work for a living or do your laundry. Being of a certain political leaning will not make you right or godly. We've been given as humans an ability to think and reason. Thinking is a gift. We should not be in a hurry to give that away to anyone. Not to technology, religion, scientific dogma, and not to political diatribe. Thinking for ourselves is our best defense against mind control. In episode 2, I go head-on into victim shaming, how the sex abuse survivors fit into society and why people shun us. A survivor's perspective, which may surprise you. What is the place in society for a sex assault victim? My answer? There isn't one. First, society, we need to face the reality that abuse happens to both young men and women, and also adult men and women. The abused have to carry guilt and shame in society simply because there's no place to safely confront our abusers. The guilt we hold eats us alive until it can no longer be contained. Until some sort of thing happens, an action must take place eventually. Often that action is suicide. And the indoctrination of society is that the victim did something to deserve getting attacked or abused. The indoctrination and popular belief has zero, and I repeat that, zero sympathy from society. If something happens to you in this arena, you're truly on your own. So it's a secret. And you then participate in keeping the secret that your abuser wants you to keep, simply because facing societal reprimand seems scarier. We're entering into a pact involuntarily. Where does a sex victim belong? In society. We belong everywhere. The outlook society has towards victims of unwanted sexual advances, molestation, violent rape has got to change. It won't if we don't call ourselves on it first. Check yourself. How do you frame the victim? And then take the time to evolve yourself on this topic. In episode 3, I begin exploring unethical hypnosis used by cults for indoctrination, togetherness, love bombing. This is the stuff we deal with the rest of our lives. Listen. Carol Giambalvo goes on to say that repeated induction into trance often results in greater degrees of susceptibility and deeper hypnotic states. The cultist becomes more pliable and less critical, more dissociated from his or herself, and readily accepts more preposterous notions as fact. Wow, her description literally is giving me flashbacks to some of those notions I saw groups accepting that were preposterous, such as healing and food manifestation. Prolonged trances produce persistent and involuntary trances even after one leaves the hypnotic environment. Wow, that's a bombshell. What is termed as floating can occur in almost any situation the cultist considers evil or threatening, such as danger or sexual desire. One of the scientists who studied hypnotism in the same article, Clark, states that he is convinced that prolonged trance states can sometimes result in long-lasting or permanent impairment of critical thinking abilities. critical judgment, or emotional responsive range. I headed over to topatalk.com. I found an amazing article by Steve K. Dubrow-Eichel. What's stated in the article is the ability to resist influence against experiences such as mass therapy, thought reform, and mind control. First, it's a misconception to think that brainwashing is always done using bizarre-looking devices. It's most effective to be subtle. You need at least to have the illusion of choice for brainwashing to be effective. The expert manipulator leaves people unaware of their influence. Episode 4, I begin introducing adult children of cults to the audience. We're like adult children of alcoholics, Dr. Knapp says. See what you think. But there's a special problem for adult children of cults in society. Our identity and our reality is challenged so early in life that we never formed our personality without tremendous outside influence. We never formed our personality completely. This is true especially for those of us who were preteen. Even worse if you were born into a cult or a dangerous group. These conspiracies exist, and I'm not talking about theories. You have had a conspiracy actually run on you and your family. So I found a great article called Transcendental Meditation and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, A Critical View. This article is by John M. Knapp, Knapp, October 29th, 2007. It was published in 2007, and it's on the topic of adult children of cult members. I would like to just, use the term adult children of cults. I was attracted to that term sort of because of Alcoholics Anonymous, who use the term adult children of alcoholics. Well, they're using the same term. So it's written by a family therapist. The therapeutic needs of adult children of cult members are quite different from those of cult members who joined as adults. That's a big statement, and that is my message. The primary task of an adult cult member in recovery is to reconnect with his or her persona as it existed before joining the cult. An ACOC who was exposed to a cult from birth or before 14 years old has no pre-cult identity to fall back on. Their plight has received much less attention from cult scholars until recently, and that's in 2007. Okay, so he also goes on to say, in my work with therapy clients who are adult children of cult members, I have been struck by the similarity of their characteristics and those of adult children of alcoholics. I was drawn to explore this connection because I observed that many adult children appeared to protect their parents from any blame for what my clients endured as children and to continue to suffer as adults. This tendency is very prevalent and has been noted in the literature for years. The more I researched, the more parallels I found. People in society want to know how cults are even possible, how the KKK and radical groups even happen. No one knows more about that than adult children of cults. You're way past the idea that it's not possible and can even answer details to society, questions on how it happens. You're a valuable resource to society. There is no disputing this, and that is my message to you. You who survived a cult as a child, you're not in denial that something like this couldn't happen, like most people are. Your brain knows the warning signs. Internal alarms go off. If you're strong enough, and if you're ready, it's time to share your wisdom with the world as a cautionary tale. The amygdala is part of the brain which governs our fight or flight syndrome. In episode 5, I articulate what is amygdala hijacking. Here's an excerpt. Today we're going to talk about a part of the brain called the amygdala. Parts of the brain have been developed over thousands of years, generations, and we have the benefit of our ancestors' knowledge of survival in our brain. What's a threat? What could harm us? Triggers the part of the brain that's known as the amygdala. You'll use your threatened part of the brain to tap instincts to stay alive. This again, the cult leader or manipulator knows. The amygdala is the part of the brain that manages this, and I want to cite a few articles about how it plays a part in our PTSD and involuntary reactions Let's start with the article at unlearninganxiety.com by Namita. She's the author of The Number One Thing to Do in Anxiety, and it's a free download available at unlearninganxiety.com. It's deep inside the emotional brain. It's operating unconsciously. It's immediate, instinctive, automatic reactions which happen before your consciousness kicks in. The amygdala reacts to new or threatening objects in the environment. It sends immediate rapid-fire signals to the brain and body to make your body ready to fight or flight the situation. The heart beats faster, muscles tense, blood pressure rises, adrenaline is pumped into the bloodstream, more sweating, lungs also take in more O2, and many more reactions. Episode 6, we head back to a second Tuesday in sexuality. An Epstein update. Can sex assault survivors be sexy? Yes, we can. We were each forced to, as one book I read put it, become asexual or hypersexual during our recovery. While we establish new boundaries, this happens like we're swinging on a pendulum. When a predator sexualizes and conditions you sexually against your will, whether it was violent or manipulative in execution, one time or multiple times, it changed your very center of gravity sexually, your point of balance, your balance of yourself. Doing that changes your sense of self, your identity. Is this what they enjoy knowing the most, our predators? I often wonder. We're social sexual beings. I can assure you that your sexual power is not gone. It's not. Are you allowed to be sexy? If we have been victimized, how can you regain that? Can you feel safe while doing that? Can you experience confidence sexually? In short, yes, I've done it. We cannot do this as victims, only as survivors. For sex assault survivors, this can be simple. Things like taking our bodies back, learning to reclaim your body and health. If you were not allowed to exercise by a controlling predator, as I wasn't, that has an effect on you and your habits and your sense of self and your health. Just taking that back and getting a routine where you exercise daily or 2 to 3 times per week is a part of recovery. It may feel odd, different, or unfamiliar or uncomfortable because you were conditioned not to do it aggressively. You work, though, to initially get past the emotional discomfort and mental alarms going off. You have to set small and realistic goals. Forget everyone else. They do not know what you're going through. Be compassionate with yourself. Allow yourself to go at your own pace. You have time. Time means nothing at all. Trying new styles as you reform your identity is important too. Both men and women who are survivors have to go through this. We have to retrain our view of ourselves, reshape it, quite literally. Use positive reinforcement and self-talk to get there. Retrain yourself to have a positive body image, not listening to the whispers of words spoken in the past by your aggressor. One of my favorite researched essays, Episode 7, Menticide. What is it? How do cults and other abusers use it? This episode includes multiple articles and is my favorite episode so far. It's an answer to how psychological murder takes place, though many believe it does not exist. The battleground is of the mind. A few years ago, I learned the term menticide. As I read through today's articles, you will see it's just as devastating as all the other sides: homicide, suicide, genocide. The idea that someone can play psychological games on you and change your sense of self is at the core of the description of menticide. Menticide is about taking everything you have away systematically. My vague descriptions of menticide are not going to do it justice. So here's an excerpt of an article done by Mark Hubbs called Psychological Murder, Death by Covert Abuse. Written December 7th, 2009. Mark Hubbs is a writer-researcher on mind, science, and conspiracy. He's the author of Know Your Enemy, Reflections of NPD. Pernicious abuse. It goes unrecognized, but it exists. It exists on an extremely covert level. Psychological murder can take many forms, but the type I'm really referring to is of a covertly narcissistic and/or sociopathic nature. It may be too difficult for some people to be able to comprehend, but it does happen, and I've seen it happen. Narcissist or sociopath or narcopath attempts to convince someone who has discovered their unbelievably shallow secrets gradually over time that they are crazy and proceeds to manipulate them into keeping quiet or to ultimately face their wrath. They use techniques such as crazy making, character assassination, and gaslighting in order to get their victims to question their own sanity. So let me add here, anytime you hear they're crazy, I would just caution you as my listener to look at what is really going on in that person's life. Are they a whistleblower? Are they speaking out? Notice how convenient it is for someone to slap the label crazy on them. And most of us as cult survivors have definitely had this happen because this is a proactive way for them to make sure we shut up. In 8, I take on addiction to group. This is something that's under discussed. How do cults play on our desire to belong? Here's my take. Let's talk about being addicted to the group in cults. Those of us who were kids in a cult know nothing else. We were immersed in a group of hundreds, if not thousands, of people on a regular basis. So immersed that we rarely had time alone. A focus on the individual is not allowed unless it's directed by the master and serves the group in some way. But have you ever thought about the addiction to group? I really enjoyed breaking that when I left. I still remember relishing being alone, and I still relish being alone. Being alone is a luxury. Thinking, just feeling you in your own skin was something we as adult children of cults were deprived of. Even those who went to a cult as an adult were immediately deprived of alone time. Because that's when you think and have critical thoughts, when you're alone. The level of control needed to convert someone to crazy religious doctrines is quite a lot. Those who maintain jobs while in a cult are the lucky ones. You're less damaged because you retained a sense of self, even if it was your work self. That self was separate from the cult, the church, and the group's demands, and that gave you some relief. Even if you hate your job, it brought you some relief from the pressure of the group. Those of us who dropped out of school to be full-time in a cult know a different experience. Like anything, it can become addictive for the wrong reasons. But that group think, that group existence, that was our first primary social experience. Yes. The addiction we deal with is that the high we were controlled by was fake, fleeting, and temporal. It no longer exists. It was created, manufactured, synthetic. The high of the group dynamic is only possible under the circumstance of crazy. A crazy leader decides to live in an unsustainable fantasy and take as many people along with them as possible. And now next in episode 9, we make history. The first public discussion about the destructive cult we were in with my mother. Sadly, my sister's not ready to take this step, and we respect that. This episode covers so much and really touched those who've experienced family separation. It's only a small part, and I would definitely encourage you to listen to the whole episode. Episode 9, with my OG mom. Today is a very special broadcast. Today I'll have my first public conversation with my mom about the cult we both survived, Morningland. Morningland Church sometimes called Church of the Ascended Christ, but always Morning Land, is in Long Beach, California.
This is, like you said, a very monumental situation for us. We're both teary-eyed today because we've worked really, really hard.
From what I recall in our conversations, you try to go to deprogrammers first. You mentioned you knew the name Rick Ross at that time, and I know he runs a website now, Cult Education Institute.
There were 2 or 3 different people I was communicating with to see if it was even feasible for a child who had been in an organization that is considered a cult and now is an adult, how hard it is for them to be transformed, if you will, changed their way of thinking about the cult.
Yeah. So Cult Awareness Network was available to the public, and they wanted to educate people about the danger of cults. Let's talk about one of the speakers you heard, Dr. Jolly West. Now, he's an expert from UCLA, but little known to you or I. I've recently found out he was involved in MK Ultra. I think it was Tom O'Neill, an author who spent many years trying to research this. And Jolly West went through his life saying, I will sue you if you ask me about MK Ultra. But he spoke on hypnotisms. Tell us about that event. What was it like?
My very first national event to attend, and it was held in Chicago. I attended his lecture on hypnosis, and it was about an hour long, and it was very interesting. A lot of detail, and when I walked away, I felt like the idea of a cult was to introduce hypnosis very subtly, very, very subtly, little at a time, and before you know it, you're hooked. When I met Steve Hassan, it was at Priscilla Coates' home, where she had a meeting for Los Angeles group, and Steve's first book. I bought his first book there and had a moment where I was speaking with him very early in his journey.
In 10, I discussed the Larry Ray family, a.k.a. the Sarah Lawrence sex cult. It's a New York situation where a dad moves into a liberal arts campus townhouse dorm and then forms a group with teens of his daughter's dorm mate. The trial has been in the news. This is from episode 10. Every first Tuesday, I focus on mind control. And I've got a really crazy story to expose here, which is happening live in the news right now. I bet a lot of you have been paying attention to it. The Sarah Lawrence sex cult in New York. He started by taking on cooking and cleaning and having movies and discussions in the townhouse. They looked at Ray as a father figure. The townhouse-made campus at Sarah Lawrence College had 7 to 8 people living there, and that's their style of dorms, a bit different from the normal dormitory. Students were disarmed by his helping role, and some began disclosing mental health issues to him that they were struggling with. Larry said he could help them, despite having no training in a psychological field and not being a licensed therapist. He went as far as saying he could help with mental discipline training he had learned in the government. When one of the housemates, Isabella Pollock, went through a bad breakup, Larry swooped in. Laying in Isabella's bed, he stroked her hair and moved soon into her room and slept there. Over 2 days of testimony, alleged victim Claudia Drury told the court how Ray allegedly forced her into a life of prostitution, abused her, and threatened to kill her after ingratiating himself with her and her friends when she was a student at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. Jurors heard often harrowing testimony from Drury, 31, as she chronicled in disturbing detail how Ray allegedly bullied and groomed her into a life of prostitution, convincing her she had to make amends for egregious wrongs and repay debt of more than $100,000. Some things we experience in cults are pretty unbelievable, like sexual mind control. Huh? What's that? How and why does it happen? How does it work? Check out episode 11's excerpt. Today's topic is about sexuality in cults and mind control. Have you ever wondered why abusers, religious cult leaders always use sex to control their victims? Let's start with stating that, like rape and war, these are acts of war, acts for the purpose of domination and control, not just for getting sex. Let's start with this article I found by David McDermott. I think his points are very astute. The website is called decision-making-confidence.com. Sex and mind control. This guy was a plastic surgeon. He got burnt out, and then he left to study neuro-linguistic programming. Psychopaths manipulate people's emotions and recognize that sex and mind control are a powerful combination. If they can convert the relationship into a sexual one, they begin to have much more control because the person has opened themselves up in a much more intimate way. A sexual relationship is also a more committed relationship, blinded by emotion. Sex and mind control are a potent mixture used by psychopaths to build strong bonds with their victims, and frequently the victims report that after a honeymoon period, things change. The psychopath knows that their control of the victim is sufficient, that they can now begin to do whatever they like. Their real nature begins to show up. Sex and mind control is also used in many cults to maintain control and manipulation. Changing the beliefs and values about sex is another way to destroy an individual's limits and boundaries and keep them within the group. Whether it's in a cult or a one-to-one relationship, such as therapist-client or teacher-student. The imbalance of power means that there's no informed consent, and therefore it constitutes sexual abuse. Any benefits that may have existed at the start of the relationship are contaminated. In episode 12, there are quotes from my forthcoming unpublished memoir and news articles to sum up legal and city and state issues Morningland Church has had from its inception in 1973. In April of 1978, Charles Rickers and Inez Binham went to the city council in Escondido. Their complaints on Morningland included the organization was breaking up marriages, seeking control of minors, and making false claims of medical cures. A woman named Kathy May was living through breast cancer and receiving healing from Sri Donato and the Gopis at the same time. They claimed to heal her, but she died of the breast cancer. Her husband sued for $22 million and received $50,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Morningland used a very high-profile lawyer named Ed Masry, of Aaron Brockovich fame, to handle this issue. This would be the beginning of a long relationship with Masry for the church and Sri Patricia. To backtrack, in summer of 77, my family returned from sabbatical. All members of Morningland in Long Beach were put out to await a callback right after Donato died. Some never got called back. How I wish now that we had not. We were called back, and my mom remembers there being much discussion amongst members of the church about who was left, how Donato died, and the fact that all the Gopis and Sri Patricia moved back to Long Beach and now ran it. There was no more Escondido. Sri Patricia changed her name to Sri Donato. 1978 was a big year for Morningland, and we knew very little of what was happening. Remember, there's no internet, and a very intense closed-mouth campaign was definitely in progress to control the information the Long Beach members got about what was going on in Escondido. We knew nothing. Why is sleep deprivation used in brainwashing and mind control? How do we get affected by it long term? Here's the clip from episode 13. This episode is about sleep deprivation, but I've only recently barely made the connection from sleep deprivation to muscle memory. Wow, this is kind of important. Recent findings suggest that sleep plays a housekeeping role that removes toxins in your brain that build up while you're awake. Everybody needs sleep, but its biological purpose remains a mystery. Sleep affects almost every type of tissue and system in the body, from the brain, heart, and lungs to metabolism, immune function, mood, and disease resistance. On the website ncbi.nlm.nih.gov, Yavuz Selvi of the Turkish Neuropsychiatric Society also weighs in on this topic. They focus on reporting results of their clinical sleep studies. Check this out. According to the results of our study, sleep deprivation for one night was determined to cause decrease on depressive mood, increase dissociative symptoms, and to lower the tendency of suppressing the unwanted thoughts consciously. Whoa, wait a minute. There's a golden key right there on why a cult or conditioning, torture, or mind control actor would want us to have sleep deprivation. It really lowers the natural defenses of the mind. It's First Tuesday again, and I look at who owns the social media we have to use to communicate with each other. Check that out in episode 14. You may be surprised. The White House officially asked TikTok influencers to participate. They gathered 30 influencers, very young, to fill them with a message to take back to their followers. Via Newsweek.com March 16th article, one Gen Z, Ellie Zeeler, is an influencer on TikTok. She said, "I'm a White House correspondent for Gen Z," she told the Washington Post. The White House called for unity with Ukraine in its war on the call and to blame the high gas prices on Putin. That's the message they wanted to get out. I'm not even going to comment on the war today. So a Chinese-based social media app is being used by the government in the United States to push a narrative about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Nothing weird about that. Religion and sexuality are insincere partners. That's what episode 15 is all about. So in today's episode, I aim to challenge your views on the entanglement of sexuality and religion and put forth that they are not only insincere partners, but are surely corrupted and about totalist control. Different psychologists, some I quoted in episode 11 regarding sexual mind control, illustrate that the person that controls your reproductive system controls you. Take a minute and think about it. Whether it's a stepmother, the in-laws, or your Mima, telling us how to breed holds power. Telling us who to mate with does too. It's tied to our very identity of self. So forming a religion involves careful considerations about sex, and cult and religious leaders never leave it out. Why? Because these groups are all about controlling their members at the very core. Whether it's mild or suggesting roles of marriage, or if it's extreme and enslaving young children members sexually because God said, there is a spectrum, and all religion is somewhere on the rainbow. Religious rituals are still being used worldwide to harm children and women, and religion will tell you what to do with your kids once you have them, how they should act sexually once they become mature. So it's generational. It's a lot of life control. Man has used religion to scare people into doing things using religious doctrine since time immemorial. You would think we'd have learned by now that it's not necessary. You'd think with our increased evolutional brain power, we'd have moved past this by now. But as a majority, we have not. I opened the topic of human trafficking in cults in episode 16 using articles on legal cases against Nation of Islam and Scientology in the news right now. In this episode, I want to deal specifically with coercive trafficking that cults do. First, here is the DHS, Department of Homeland Security's full definition of human trafficking. And they only dedicated a special unit for trafficking in the United States as late as 2000, 20 years ago. That's something I found out in research for today's show. Kind of surprising. It's not like trafficking started 20 years ago. So according to DHS.gov, human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the United States. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. 3 individuals who were raised in Scientology and forced to work in its service from childhood today filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against Scientology's leader, David Miscavige. From MarketWatch.com by Elizabeth Hudson. A woman wins $8 million judgment from the cult that enslaved her for a decade. This past May, a federal judge in Kansas awarded Kendra Ross nearly $8 million in a human trafficking suit against a nationwide cult and its leader, Royal Jenkins. This judgment is the largest civil single plaintiff human trafficking award in American history. In addition to the significance of the larger monetary award, this case provides important precedent for forced labor cases and exposes common myths and misconceptions about human trafficking in the United States. In her complaint, Kendra alleged that Jenkins and the Value Creators Incorporated, formerly known as the United Nation of Islam, forced her to work for more than 40,000 uncompensated hours from 2002 until her 2012 escape from the cult. Profiting from her unpaid labor, the cult shipped Ross from Kansas City to New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Georgia, and Tennessee to work around the clock in the cult's businesses, restaurants, and homes. What's the difference between a person who went to a cult as an adult and those who went as a kid or were born into a cult? A lot. That's episode 17's clip. The college fund is often given to the cult or church quite immediately. It is tithed, and that's it. The parent only retains what is needed immediately, and because of that, is almost immediately financially insolvent. This is how the cult, the church, high-demand group, scam stays alive. This is what trafficking is all about, and as Negan in The Walking Dead says, people are a resource. The kids also provide entertainment, a punching bag, and a sex doll for all the pent-up sexual desires of the clergy. Period. This abuse can last years once it's all set up. The kids provide labor, which allows the religion/cult to expand without any cost. Only the child bears the cost. The family may be a great resource for the church for what seems to be on average of about 10 years. Then, when their faith wanes or they somehow snap out of the hypnotic state, a number of things can happen. None of them are the family bands together and leaves together to start over. The cult has made sure of that. That's part of the strategy. The family who, and all families are, separated in the religious cult or the high-demand group, they are used by the leaders against one another. Moving to episode 18, my first Fifth Tuesday guest is cult survivor, author, Army intelligence captain, and rape culture destroyer, Daniela M. Young. This very intense book review and interview. Her book is called Uncultured. Check it out in episode 18.
My why for pulling the trigger on doing this book wasn't actually related to the cult. It was related to the Army. Vanessa Guillen was murdered. They didn't look for her. Sitting in the dark in my house, super triggered. And I'm like, why won't they stop killing us, right? Raping us, killing us. It's the parallels of kids in a cult and women in the military.
Episode 19 explores apocalypticism in religion through time and through the history of the world. It's nothing new. A lot of times questioning authority and the propaganda being fed to us simply involved asking if it makes any sense. Since propaganda is created to sell an idea to a large body of human beings, it often does not make logical sense. Do you think, then, that it's time to question the validity of religious doctrines? All of them, fundamentally? Because God is the largest propaganda machine of them all. God is the biggest grift on the planet. If you haven't faced that yet, you have some thinking to do. This episode was pretty thought-provoking for me to research alongside of all the world government propaganda I'm seeing on the news about war, gun violence, death, health, and a revision globally of how we live as a society. We need our critical thinking skills more than ever right now, guys. The Lalas de Mundo case locked up a pedophile, which was a long time coming. Episode 20's clip here is about that trial. La Luz del Mundo is a non-Trinitarian Christian denomination with international headquarters in Guadalajara and Jalisco, Mexico. La Luz del Mundo practices a form of restoration theology centered on three leaders: Aaron, born Eusebio Joaquin Gonzalez, Samuel Joaquin Flores, and Nason Joaquin Garcia. According to the Los Angeles Times, La Luz del Mundo leader Joaquin Garcia was detained by FBI agents on June 5, 2019 at the Los Angeles airport after landing in a private jet. An iPad was found inside his luggage where the police found a video of a naked 14-year-old boy, masked and receiving oral sex. The woman who performed fellatio, according to the testimonies presented by the prosecutor's office, was the adolescent's aunt. Ugh. In recent days, it had been announced that the judge had authorized that recording to be shown to the 12 members of the jury during the trial.
As to those family members that have abandoned the Jane Does, shame. Shame on you. And as to the defendant, you are a sexual predator.
You're listening to The Frankie Files. FrankieFilesPodcast.com. In episode 21, an ongoing chat with journalist Sarah Warner begins on the body cult from its origin in Alaska to its reach now to Australia and new location in Washington state.
So when I was listening to your interview on the Cult Vault podcast, one of the things I took away from that is that you felt an experience of being coerced. Can you tell us about that?
The thing that really blew my mind was there was a tape where I was talking to Katie and she was asking me all this stuff about my personal life, and I was just kind of unloading stuff about my personal life. And then right after that, I was saying something like, I really feel like all this happening right now and meeting you, and this is God. And, this is, and I am not I'm an atheist.
Okay.
And then I just sort of remembered, I had this memory of standing in this yard in Duluth, Minnesota, and watching the wind blow through the leaves and thinking this is God. And I was talking to Katie was the only person I was talking to about this, but she had sort of put that in my head, all this stuff that's going on, it's outside of your control, and it made sense. And I've heard that kind of stuff before. I was raised Catholic. There's a pattern to everything, and there's a path that God is going to send you on. But that was the only time in my life that I really believed that. And then I stopped thinking that when it slowly receded after I stopped talking to Katie.
It was a trick.
And that definitely really changed the calculus of what I wanted to do, and publishing stuff about this cult and bringing them down was that it was me and Katie had a personal relationship. We were friends. We talked about all kinds of stuff. There was just really uncomfortable stuff to listen back on in there. That was where it was kind of this is just something I'm going to do now. A couple of years after that, me and Katie got back in touch. She was out of the cult, and we had a couple conversations sort of going back into this story that Mark, the leader, knew my girlfriend at the time's name.
Oh, shoot.
From when I was talking to Katie. There was something weird on the internet that I thought like with some troll that was like posting things, and I just had to ask her. I was like,
Yeah.
but like, why would it ever be an important detail like in my personal life?
She was feeding him info.
Yeah, exactly.
That's spooky. Yeah,
It was
I
really
get
spooky.
you.
That sort of collecting of information, like a lot of
Yeah.
cults do this. I mean, like,
Yes.
cults are blackmail machines. Blackmail machines.
Blackmail machines. Blackmail machines.
Cults use similar tactics as horse trainers to condition members. Let's compare and contrast that with an article from a horsebreaker. That's episode 22. People are scared of indoctrination. Kids are afraid of strangers that are trying to replace their parents as an authority. Let's get the human used to what they're scared of. Show them that we mean no harm. See? Your parents are just over there in another room. You're safe. Your friends and siblings are near. You're okay. It's not that different from while you're at school. You'll get used to it. As humans, we are vulnerable to adapting to anything. We must understand that to avoid future indoctrination incrementally. We all learn by example, and what we learn is eventually absorbed into our personality. The challenge with the programs that we all run on is that they are operating at both a conscious and unconscious level. Some of our conscious beliefs are not in alignment with the unconscious beliefs. In fact, they actually contradict one another. What's the fastest way to recognize if you have contradicting beliefs? If your outcome is exactly the opposite of what your desires are. That's a good point. Reprogram-yourself.com was where I got that one. Here's some more from wikihow.com. If you have a desire to change the way you think and behave, it is completely 100% possible. The brain is constantly forming new connections and molding itself into how you're telling it to operate. By practicing self-awareness and staying mindful, then you can rein in those negative thoughts and destructive habits and start right now being a better, more positive you. What's tricky is that you have to use the very tool that was used against you to heal yourself, the brain. How in real time do cults like Aduco Lighthouse International Group of UK and Scientology, to name a few, silence ex-members? Let's discuss this in episode 23, a well-listened to episode. But one of the largest problems in any of these types of groups is there's never an exit plan. Why? Because sort of like the mob, the church or cult does not want anyone to leave. They want to recruit resources for keep. Sad, because they often divide families and marriages as a matter of course to get the asset they want. Whether they are pretty or wealthy or good donators of time, people are a resource to a church or religious cult, or even political cults, and I do include Democrats in cults, who often promise the world and deliver nothing. When I left, after years of selfless servitude and separation from all my family and friends, nothing was given to me to leave with. No clothing, money, I was unpaid, and not any help in making a smooth transition in my life. Of course not. I believe this is a little-known fact to people who've never experienced this. Let me explain. If you have the bad fortune, or when you're a kid, your family has had the bad fortune to be sucked into a cult, you have no idea at the time they play for keeps. You may be thinking, oh, this sounds great. The togetherness, the teachings to improve yourself, the services are uplifting and beautiful. This is a safe place to take my family. And they believe the things I believe. Those, however, are all lies. Like any trick, you keep your eye on the birdie over here, and something is happening over there. Things you didn't sign up for. Things you never would sign up for. The self-sealing group then continually ups its demands in just noticeable differences, and pretty soon you've given up everything, and it's your job to get out alive. Next up, it's Second Tuesday, and it's back to sexuality in society with trial updates of Ghislaine Maxwell and R. Kelly, and excerpts from an article by Celia Williamson on Yahoo News. From Yahoo News by Celia Williamson, Wednesday, July 6, 2022. Celia says, I've spent the last 3 decades studying sex trafficking and helping survivors. So let me help you understand why his defenders need to change their tune. A sex trafficker, no matter his station in life, no matter how much he sang sweet love songs to you, can also abuse and exploit children. Stop in the real name of love and see sex traffickers for who they are, and love and protect children unconditionally and non-judgmentally. Ooh, she's singing my song. Sex trafficking is manipulating vulnerable youth. Williamson states R. Kelly used the same tactics that sex traffickers use to lure young girls into their trap. Sex trafficking is not so much about kidnapping vulnerable youth and women and chaining them to a bed. Sex trafficking is pimping, and the game remains the same. It involves manipulating vulnerable youth. There are chains involved, but they are metaphorical chains. Sex traffickers chain minds and hearts through the use of control. According to testimony of his victims, R. Kelly controlled their behavior. They would eat when he allowed them to eat. They would use the bathroom or bathe when he allowed them to do so. When they spoke to their parents by phone, he was close by to control what they said. Over time, when the only voice you hear is that of your controller, you experience trauma bonding and will do and believe anything they say. Your thoughts become their thoughts. Celia Williamson says, it's easier to blame the victim. In my work, we call that shooting the wounded. And on an aside, I'd like to comment that I call that victim shaming. Our Cult Catch-Up episode has 4 segments in episode 25. Here's a clip of 3 of the segments with Casey from the Cult Vault podcast and Ciaran Warner from CultStories.com featured. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 25 of the Frankie Files. Today's Third Tuesday, so it's time for Cult News with a Cult Catch-Up, a preview from Cult Vault podcast.
Hello listeners, this is Casey from the Cult Vault podcast, a long-format, interview-based show that focuses on the lives and stories of cult survivors. Recently, I released episode 186 with cult mediation and recovery specialist Patrick Ryan, founder of Cult News 101. I'm also hosting a 12-hour live stream on July the 22nd from 12 noon Eastern Time to midnight, with an aim to raise awareness of the podcast and funds for the Sound Choices Coalition, a non-profit that supports people escaping polygamy and other destructive religious practices. Coming up in the next couple of months, I have interviews with former Worldwide Church of God survivors, authors, therapists, and more. Come and join me at the Cult Vault podcast, wherever you get your podcasts.
An update on Cult, entitled Lighthouse International Group, run by Paul Waugh in the UK, who was recently exposed in the Daily Mail.
Seriously, we have them here broken down in a heap. We have all the evidence here. Everything's recorded here. Everything I say has been recorded. Everything I've ever said, everything they've ever said has been recorded. And everything they've ever wanted or felt or feared has been written down in their journals that have forwarded to their mentor. We've got them all here. And protected. These are people's lives we're talking about. We're more than discreet. We're protective. Very protective. Writing all the stuff in the world like they're the main thing in the world. On a site like Reddit, for example, that is full of pedophilia. How typical. Known as the dirt bin of the internet, by the way. They're on that. Because we're trying to help people that have been abused mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, sexually. By and large. One or all of them. And some of them, all of them.
A report from Ciaran Warner directly on the Cultish podcast, Hiding Its True Cause, Recruitment into a Christian Cult.
Hello, Frankie T's and the Frankie Files listeners. This is Ciaran Warner. I'm a journalist who runs an online magazine about cults called The Body International. cult podcast called Cultish is essentially a front to indoctrinate people into extremist right-wing Christianity. This is a show about cults from a Christian perspective that's actually a recruitment vehicle for a cult. And the leader of this group is named Jeff Durbin. Jeff Durbin is the host of Cultish. He is also the minister. It's called Apologia Church is the name of it, Apologia. A website called Check My Church. That is written by an author named Sarah Leanne Young, who not only had interactions with Jeff Durbin, but just collected anything that was out there that she could find.
Telling your parents what happened in a cult never happens to some survivors. And it's for good reasons. My advice after living through telling my parent and more is episode 26. At the point of telling your parents about your abuse in a high-demand religious order, cult, church, you're at an incredible catharsis point, a fire of purification not everyone lives through. Us cult kids are left to deal with serious issues that we never get to talk about because society doesn't want to hear about it. Sexual assault, contradictory social beliefs, strange ritual habits, scars, physical or emotional, unfounded fears, lack of financial knowledge, and other major handicaps such as menticide and beating down the ego to the point of devaluation. We carry out the vow of silence we were taught. The master or church leader breaks the bond of child to parent early as a matter of course, and the parent allows it as a show of devotion. It eventually becomes the parent offering their children up for sacrifice. Those who are in disbelief of this type of behavior, just picture a sports coach that tells the parent they'll shape the child's future into brilliance. Okay? Everybody knows that happens. Now picture that speech, but interject spiritual death to the parent if they interfere with the master's plan for their child. It happened to me. It's happened to millions of children, shaping their futures to serve one person, a religious criminal. Did you know America had an institution for propaganda analysis? We explore this and other tips for not getting indoctrinated, unawares. That's episode 27. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 27 of the Frankie Files. This week, it's time again for mind control topics, and it often leads us back to propaganda. Because how are you going to control a mind without the words and tricks of propaganda? Looking back to my cult days of 12 years when I was age 8 to 22 in Morningland Church in Long Beach, I can draw on what propaganda looks and feels like in real life. They put it on thick, and they successfully duped a lot of people, thousands. Having experienced that, now I can see propaganda coming, whether it's political, social, friends, family, in films and TV. When someone wants to get people on board with an idea, they have to use propaganda to do it, or they have to take it by force. And you need people to get anything done, even to take it by force. So the propaganda is always present. In war, how do you convince people to risk their lives? Go to a place with the idea of maiming and killing people through propaganda. Looking back to those times in my formative years and bringing it to now, I'm always surprised at the audacity of propaganda. It's bold and it's persuasive. It doesn't have to be too creative. It just has to play on people's fears and desires. Propaganda has some trademark traits that are known. Here are some to look out for from my own experience. Later, we're going to get into the Institute of Propaganda Analysis that used to exist in America. And they wrote 7 telltale signs of propaganda. We're going to get into that. First, propaganda is uniform. The idea is repeated by multiple sources, groups, companies, exactly the same. The talking points are rote, relayed, and coordinated while being reduced to 1 or 2 words or sentences. Second, it's bold. It may sound so ludicrous and audacious at first that it may make you curious to get an explanation or ask questions. 3, it comes at you from multiple parties and feels like peer pressure. It's everywhere. It's unavoidable. Propaganda is used every day to get things done. From an interesting website about ideas called bigthink.com, I found some really good detail about the type of person who does or is good at propaganda. They're called sophists. In ancient Greece, there were sophists. Sophists are people who use their intellect for personal gain rather than the pursuit of knowledge. By applying lessons from great thinkers, we make life harder for modern sophists, often politicians and self-help gurus. It's Second Tuesday again, and it's time to appeal to sex assault victims to begin speaking out with quotes from Robert J. Lifton. It's about going from victim to survivor in episode 28. Today's Second Tuesday, and I usually reserve this for the topic of sexuality in society. I'm going to take a different approach today to the topic of survivors. How do we head from victim to survivor in recovering from what happened? One dominant specialist on this topic is a thinker in his 90s who's had a lot to say in this area of societal issues. Robert J. Lifton, and Lifton is spelled L-I-F as in father, T-O-N. I learned about Lifton from a podcast episode of Influence Continuum by Steve Hassan. The episode is called Dr. Robert J. Lifton on Current Events and the Importance of Survivors Telling Their Story. Imagine hiding such an awful secret for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And people do. I speak from experience. And it's sort of like having a bullet embedded in your body. Somewhere it could give you massive problems if it moves around. Even poison your bloodstream. Even affect your health long term, very long term, and other complications. I liken holding this type of toxic emotional and physical trauma in to having a bullet lodged in your body. We have to, at some point, remove the bullet. Not everyone speaks publicly. Some speak anonymously. And remember, there are many levels to doing it, so consider this. Next, I do a sweeping introduction to New Age religion. This is the type of religion that destroyed my family. Episode 29's clip here. New Age religion. What is New Age religion? We've all heard a lot about it. But it wasn't until I started reading Dr. Janja Lelish's book, Bounded Choice, that I began to really understand. And it's a precursor to the studies she did on Heaven's Gate. So it's pretty interesting because if you say it's benign or not dangerous, I can argue 39 people who believed New Age religious ideas took their own lives. A lot of damage has been done by flighty New Age thinking. The religious alternative my mom chose was based in the New Age, but what is it? It now permeates America. One of my friends who's into art commented that her teacher online signs her correspondences with the word namaste. That means I bow to the divinity within you, and that's a Sanskrit term. That's from India. And you can now find this type of language in grocery propaganda, a lot of vegan foods, on TV, via influencers. There's not a thought about passing along some type of abbreviated Eastern philosophy or hodgepodge New Age sentiment. And no one even pays attention to it. It's become so commonplace in USA since the 1960s. It's become incredibly commonplace. With freedom of religion comes many oddities. And New Age is just one of them. But I wanted to get into some answers and find out how it's so cemented into our culture. But I didn't really understand the roots of it until I started on Dr. Ladish's book. I'm going to read several excerpts from her book today, focusing on New Age religion, its roots, its history, its doctrines. To prepare for telling my own trafficking story on episode 159 of Emancipation Nation podcast, I breached the topic of trafficking kids into cults. It's happening daily in the United States. This is episode 30. Why is it important to recognize propaganda and see each church's dogma sold? Because this is how the trafficking takes place, not through force. Even violent crimes happen because the person is told they're serving God in doing this or allowing this. Hashtag because God. God is the most powerful and scary propaganda. And this church leader, pastor, preacher, clergy, etc. is in contact with God. That is already established. And if you think about people who dismiss mind control as not being important, well, let me ask you this. How did your body decide to make moves? How does it make a decision to get up, walk, and do something? Your brain tells it to, right? So if you convince someone of a certain propaganda, their brain will send signals to take care of that in the form of an action. So getting someone to believe something is very powerful. Our fifth Tuesday guest is the highlight of my time during the podcast so far. Though I can be heard learning to pronounce her name publicly, I got it right now. Dr. Janja Lalich is an amazing resource. See janjalalich.com, JANJALALICH.com for her work. Episode 31. The honor was all mine. Listen.
I kind of consider myself a social psychologist, but psychology is kind of looking at the one person and like what's wrong with this one person. And there's a lot of pathologizing built into the various psychotherapeutic trends. Whereas sociology is really looking at the interactions between people and groups of people and how the society affects groups and how groups affect society and how groups affect the individual and so on. And so it's so much more, for me anyway, it's so much more about real life.
I learned that you interviewed the daughter of the leader of the cult I was in.
Yeah.
Female leader.
I saw your post about that. Yeah.
So Morning Land is a church from 72 to now. And the leader died in 2003. Her daughter was estranged by her. And you interviewed her while I was kind of replacing her as a trainee to the leader in my teen years.
I think what her interview showed, as well as some of the other children of cult leaders that I interviewed, is that in most cases, they weren't really treated as special. And in many ways, they were even more neglected, quote, regular members. So yes. I think that was certainly the crux of her experience where, she was completely neglected by her mother and told to get out of the way. And her mother would spend hours and hours in various sessions. And she just kind of had to make do on her own. So interesting that you then were her, quote, replacement in a way. And then she was sent away. She was basically sent away by her mother, which she talks about in the book. So you'll see that.
Episode 32 leads up to the conference in Ohio she created. I'm joined by Celia Williamson. She runs a department at Toledo University on anti-trafficking and is 20 plus years in the field. She runs the Emancipation Nation podcast. With the 19th annual human trafficking conference coming up, how did
this conference come about? That's a long time running.
Oh, well, now you're going to make me tell on myself, because let me tell you how it started.
Tell me.
So in 2004, I was saying to myself, we're doing some stuff here in the community, and I know other people are doing things all over the country, and like, what, we need to get together. So what do you call? That's called a conference. Okay, well, let's have one, and we're going to call it a national conference. And the people around me said, well, wait a minute, we can't just call something a national conference and then just do it. And I said, why not? Why can't we? Like, who has elected us, or who's legitimized us to do it? I said, I did. So there you go.
Yeah.
And
that's how stuff gets done.
That's how stuff gets really done, for real.
Go, Celia.
So they said, well, I don't know about it. I said, well, I'll get a student, because I'm a university professor, so I can find students. Hey, student, do you know how to build a website? Okay, build a website, say we're having a national conference. And the student did. And then I went around and I made copies. I put a program together. I made copies at the university. I went around to all my friends and all their social service programs. And I asked them, hey, how many copies can you make before you get in trouble? And we'll make these copies. and then people came from all across the country. We didn't pay these people. We didn't even buy their hotel rooms. And they came, and my mother and my sister cooked delicious food for them for lunch. And they were at the university, and the university came over and they said, well, wait a minute, you can't just have people cook. You have to get a caterer. You have to. And I said, oh, okay, well, I didn't know. And so then people said, well, you got to do this next year. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I have the energy. And so 19 years later, this is the really the largest academic conference on human trafficking in the world.
Wow. I know that, there is always the rule followers.
Yes.
And then there's people that go, well, we're going to make some new rules like yourself.
Absolutely. Well, the university finally came over 3 years later, and they were like, who gave you permission to do this? I said, nobody. I just did it. Am I supposed to ask for permission? Oh, I didn't know. But I did know.
Love has won, but not really. A story of contemporary New Age madness in episode 33.
Amy claims in the past that she has a relationship with the spirit of Robin Williams. She said that Robin is now Archangel Zadkiel. In 2007, Amy left her husband and 3 kids, along with her manager's job in Texas, to move to Colorado, where she shacked up with White Eagle from this forum, which is lightworkers.org. In 2007, when she moved to Crestone, Colorado, there's a note here from this true crime blog that Crestone has a reputation for housing many people like Amy. They formed a group called Galactic Federation of Light. Her followers believed Amy's reincarnations included Joan of Arc and Cleopatra, as well as, I said earlier, Jesus and Marilyn Monroe. Miguel Lamboy was one of her partners, said he suffered from end-stage lung cancer and had already had a lung removed. Followers believed Amy, Mother God, healed him and cemented their faith in her and the group. Love is One became a 501c3 nonprofit charitable org in 2019, thanks to Miguel's effort. They changed their structure. This is so much like Heaven's Gate. Ugh, it's spooky. A group of followers known as First Contact Ground Crew Team would video daily updates for hours each day, quest to help Amy assist the world to ascend. And if you do look at New Age, their goal is to bring in a New Age. They believe that the New Age within each person, and we're going to usher in a New Age. It doesn't say, what the New Age will be. It's vague.
Another cult catch-up with Ciaran Warner, the journalist, on The Body Cult and how to give a cult a Google search problem. Episode 34.
I mean, there's this woman who's missing who has 6 kids. That's not Melissa Parker. That's her sister. And that's pretty recent. Yeah, Becky Stanton, or Becky Parker. I have not been able to find a trace of her since 2020 when she signed a mortgage. That's like the last update about like in her life. Like nothing, no pictures, no social media, no. You keep doing it. But I've given the body like a Google problem. Like if you Googled the body, right, Alaska, Tenasket, like if you used all the keywords, like when I started, you would find nothing. There's a Newsweek article. Now there's like my website is the first result now. And there's like pictures of these people and YouTube videos, and it just goes on and on. And this podcast is going to be on the internet. Like that's another thing that will be a Google result, and you just give them like that sort of like negative press or whatever. I mean, you could look up like Scientology, and like the first result is going to be like, "Hey, we're Scientology, we're great," and maybe the third result is like, "This is a cult." Like handing over a Google problem is like a good thing to aspire to, I guess. Creating a web presence, and anybody could start like. You could, if you're like a survivor too, you could start an anonymous, like WordPress, or it might seem insignificant, but it's not, because, well, I don't really want to join this group anymore since I read this story that was horrible. Yes.
My very special guest in episode 35 is an anti-child bride activist in USA who belonged to a Sufi sect she was born in. Her voice is amazing, and I encourage you to support her work. Listen to episode 35 now.
She was just my mother. They had this idea of what mothers were supposed to be. And if you didn't fit that exact image, then you were a bad mother. And it's like, who are you to say who a mother is? Like, she wasn't perfect by any means. I mean, she definitely had issues. She was a good mom. I don't care what, looking back at it now, it's like I wish I had the voice to say that to them then. When I was taken out of the country, I got pregnant. They took me back. My abuser took me back to California, the Bay Area. And we were legally married in a drive-through wedding chapel in Reno, Nevada. Was a permission slip from my father. My mom did not have to be notified. And the fact that I was pregnant actually made it easier for me to get married. Yeah, in the state of Nevada at that time, it made it easier for the authorities to look away. So that was actually written into the statute at the time. It has since changed because myself and other survivors have come forward and testified in Nevada and have changed the law.
Episode 36 begins the back to school theme, looking at how cults influence the education of young people and talking about the troubled teen industry. The NXIVM case continues to make news. This woman's story will blow your blood as Allison Mack manipulates a willing young webmaster, Tabitha Chapman. She joins me in conversation in episode 36.
Really question it if it starts to feel, you start to feel a little tug in your heart that says like, oh, that's kind of weird. Why would they say that? Question it, okay? Because it's very important in this sense. Some people may or may not have heard of Allison Mack. So she actually recruited me. She emailed me and asked me to work on her official site with her. I had been running a fan site for her. And so then when I went to go meet her in Vancouver to talk about the proposition, if you will, she stated that in order for her to hire me, I'd have to take these seminars. Yeah, so that's how that started. So I agreed after much deliberation with my partner at the time. So Allison had presented it this way to me. Some people are calling it a cult. So I want you to Google it.
She did, huh?
She said that to me. But, I've been to it and I haven't seen anything weird. And it's all up, and, it's changed my life. And I just want my whole team to take it so that I know that I'm working with an ethical group of people.
Meeting Andrew Pledger online is great because for all he has survived from the IFB cult in his youth, it has not killed his sense of humor. Episode 37 is with LGBT plus community member Andrew Pledger, and he tells his incredibly brave story.
Heart is evil, that you can't trust your mind or your thoughts, that you can't really think for yourself, and all your decisions should be based on the doctrine of the church or praying to God or using the Bible. Anything outside of that was unacceptable. So a lot of information control, kind of like referring to Stephen Hassan's bite model, because after leaving and using Stephen Hassan's bite model to compare to my experiences in IFB, I was like, oh my gosh, that was definitely a cult. Growing up in that, I had a lot of negative experiences, and I always, every week I left church, and I always felt so sad or felt so much shame. I never left that place feeling good, but I was told I was supposed to feel that way. Bob Jones and fundamentalist Christianity, it represented everything my parents wanted. It wasn't what I wanted. It was what my parents wanted me to be, what they were trying to mold me into. Part of becoming my own person was leaving that and becoming an individual. To be excommunicated in that way so publicly. If I wasn't excommunicated, I didn't feel like I could walk away from that. You know what I mean? It's so... Because for me, I'm like, if I graduate from this, number one, I have this label stuck to me my whole life. I'm a Bob Jones graduate, and I don't want that.
Catholic mission work is very common. Ryan unearths the horrors of one cult sect he barely survived in episode 38.
So for our punishment, we had to flagellate, to whip each other, I think 50, 60 times, I don't remember. It was hard for us because we were still kind of new to that mentality of the beatings. Of the slappings was one thing, self-flagellation was another, but beating someone else was different. So I remember my novice, the assistant to the novice master, he kind of prepped us. He was saying, okay, I know this is difficult, but try to imagine, Jesus when he took the scourging. There had to be the Roman soldiers. They had to do it because Jesus loved us and he allowed it. So as you're beating your brother, just imagine you're the soldier for Christ, and so it kind of there was guilt, but it's you have to bury it at that moment. And I went hard. They'd go hard on you. That something was wrong, but I never wanted to accept it. And I'm not sure if other survivors have gone through this, where you're presented with the truth, but you don't want to look at it because you've hold on, you've cherished this reality for so long. That's what happened to me.
In episode 39, we talked to Synanon mom, Sylvia, and daughter, Sari Crawford, the host of the Sunshine Place podcast. And this is our season finale.
It empowered Chuck because, in a way, he was the only one that seemed to care about, the addicts. You can imagine trying to feel whole again, and the entire society is like, we don't care what happens to you. We don't care what happens to your body. And Chuck's like, you matter. I'm going to build you up. I'm going to give you responsibility. And I can very easily see how, that community could rally behind Chuck and say, you believe in us and we believe in you.
What about The Wire?
The Wire was the radio station that we talked about broadcast. And it was like a real radio station. They would play music. They would play the game. And my father actually, he was Sergeant Radio. And that was his sort of alias on the radio. And his job for a while was to have a radio program.
Synanon kids.
Any kid that was in the school or any kid born there, any kid separated from their parents, we just generically called them that.
The game.
The game was a therapeutic, it started out as a therapeutic way for people to fully express themselves and be able to say whatever they wanted to each other, with the exception of no threats of violence. And it was a free space to get people to kind of open up.
I didn't know where the word synanon came from, and I looked up the words. Syn, like synthesis, together, to bring things together. Anon, again, now. Wouldn't it be great if communities like that could exist? It's always this belief in one person. It can't be one person. The power of one person thinking that they're God, they are better than anyone else, or that they have, it's just not true. He really was brilliant. I mean, he was genius in so many ways. And he did lead the community. And, it's just like every other one of these things. The people he surrounded him with kind of look at that too. I mean, Ron Cook talks about, in the thing about him carrying a gun, and I made a comment like, that's just bull. A gun in his. I said, this is over. This is no longer Synanon.
The Frankie Files is supported by listeners like you. If you're a survivor or just interested in understanding cults and coercion, you've come to the right place. From a survivor's point of view, researched essays and testimonials, plus interviews with experts and authors. But take care of yourself and always keep critically thinking. Thank you so much for the support of Season 1 of Frankie Files Podcast from the bottom of my heart. And I'll see you in February. You're listening to The Frankie Files. FrankieFilesPodcast.com. Follow me on Reddit at FrankieTees and on Twitter at FrankieTees for supplemental discussion. The Frankie Files podcast is researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Frankie Tees. You're listening to The Frankie Files. FrankieFilesPodcast.com. The Frankie Files.